So today, America once again is going to be leading by example. This morning, I signed an executive order that will do two things. First, we're going to cut the federal government's greenhouse gas emissions 40% from the 2008 levels within the next 10 years. Second, we're going to increase the share of electricity that the federal government uses from renewable sources to 30% within the next 10 years.
But still no signs of our chief executive reducing the use of his pen and phone to circumvent Congress. President Obama, of course, right there announcing his executive order on cutting the federal government's greenhouse gas emissions. Got to go in depth on this. No better guy to do that with than John Casey, the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation. John, of course, is also the author of the new book, Dark Winter. So, John, you tell us the sun is going to cool things down, but the favorite son of Hawaii, now serving as our president, says things are warming up and he's got to cut greenhouse gases. What do you make of this latest executive action?
Well, from the top-down level, the president has recognized that the now GOP-led Congress, Senate, and House will not be playing along with his global warming climate action plan, and has decided to, as he said before, use his pen and his phone. He's using his pen to sign an executive order, in effect doing what he already has authority to do, which is regulate energy consumption and thereby greenhouse gas emissions within the federal government. He doesn't need a congressional act to do that. So he can certainly act within the administration itself, and that's what that executive order is. It's only for the federal government, does not apply to the rest of the U.S. economy.
Well, let's take stock of some sound science here. Is there any reason to try and cut back on these gas emissions? Does it really have an effect on global temperatures?
Certainly not. The past efforts to control greenhouse gas emissions by arranging UN-based global agreements have essentially failed for the most part. The European Union has probably done more than anyone else. But if you look at, for example, the November agreement with China, the president pretty much gave the Chinese government free rein to produce as many coal-fired plants and greenhouse gas emissions as they would like until the year 2030. They are already ahead of us in greenhouse gas emissions, and this will make it even more certain that they will. And the quantity of the greenhouse gas emissions in China will dwarf the U.S. by that year on current plans. So what we're doing in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions will not be that much. And for that matter, from a scientific standpoint, we know now after 30 years of research and all, certainly more than $30 billion spent here in the U.S., that the climate is almost indifferent to how much CO2 there is. So much ado about nothing.
Well, politicians on the left are still expending a lot of CO2, telling us that there is an imminent threat, and that stands in stark contrast to what you're putting forth in the book Dark Winter. For those who may not be familiar with what you have to say, tell us again what you see and what you write about in Dark Winter.
The central premise of Dark Winter is fairly straightforward. It says that the sun is the primary driver of climate change on Earth, and that mankind has a very small, almost insignificant role to do with it. And all of the science that we have, the best science, best climate models, and the best climate theory now tell us that we have entered a new era for climate on the planet that will bring record cold for the next 30 years. We'll be back to where we were 200 years ago in terms of global temperature and sea level by the 2030s. And unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of collateral ill effects like crop damage, civil strife, and political upheaval that always follow these cold eras.
Well, I want to return to really what's happening with the current president, his pen and phone and executive orders. In the time that he has left in the presidency, John Casey, do you expect, you talked about the limited nature of what this does in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and what the federal government controls, but can we expect to see even more funding, even more money put into what is basically the industry of pseudoscience surrounding so-called global warming?
Fortunately, we now have a good conservative leadership in the House and Senate committees that will hopefully make sure that we stop throwing away money on this man-made global warming myth and redirect funds to where they're really needed. If you look at what the president's doing, I believe he's trying to put another feather in his legacy cap by telling the world he's done everything he can to unite the world to fight global warming. By the way, there's been no global warming for 18 years, but the president still wants to fight something that doesn't exist. He will probably make his last stand at the Paris conference on climate, sponsored by the UN later this year.
And while things may be cooling off in the not-too-distant future in terms of the Earth's climate and conditions here, political races are heating up. Now, there is talk that if problems continue with Hillary Clinton, Al Gore might return to public life. In the minute 30 that remains, John, your take on Al Gore, the money he has made, and perhaps some, to borrow the title of his book, some inconvenient truths regarding the former vice president?
Well, certainly there's quite a bit of inconvenient truth when you look at his former legacy as vice president and then later as a global advocate for controlling industrial activity and CO2 output. Certainly, he's taken a lot of just hits over the last few years. As the high priest of the global warming religion, unfortunately, his biggest failing is that he doesn't represent or follow his own guidelines. He has probably the largest carbon footprint of any former vice president, much less president. And he is certainly one that we've followed over the years through his movies and his presentations. And what he has said and what he has predicted simply have not come to pass. So we're dealing with a very bad track record based on bad science, bad outcomes, and someone who really doesn't represent the religion he preaches to.
A religion rather than sound science. Interesting way to put it. Thanks very much, John Casey. And a reminder, you can get your copy of Dark Winter, the book by John Casey, by going to newsmax.com/darkwinter. We're coming right back.